Hi, my name's Sarah Howard and I'm going to be talking about amalgamating archaeology into wider concepts and the policy pros and cons of doing so. Since its inception, archaeology has always been amalgamated into wider concepts and these often serve agendas outside of archaeology. For example, the concept of heritage, made popular by nationalistic agendas in the late 19th and early 20th century, made a resurgence in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s with the commercialisation of the past of what Robert Hewison called the heritage industry. He suggested that this nostalgia and prestige for the past was created and encouraged to fill the gap in the economy following industrialisation. Nowhere is this more apparent than in former British Prime Minister Tony Blair's policies relating to what was branded Creative Britain and the concept of cultural capital. The link between culture and economy has been strong and has dominated arguments for the benefits of culture, with cultural disciplines and their products often seen as instruments contributing to socio-economic and ultimately political agendas. It was also felt during the 1970s and 1980s that archaeology needed to be made more accessible to society, and with this the emergence of public archaeology. Of course, archaeology and heritage are not one and the same, and the archaeological resource, or the primary record of an archaeological site, is not automatically heritage, which would signify that it is valued by communities other than archaeologists. As we will see in Sam Paul's talk on archives and the examples given in the Facebook discussion on the British Archaeological Jobs Resource, or BADGER, some archaeological resources encountered through development might not become heritage because the processes required to take the raw materials extracted from the ground and to turn them into narratives have not been adequately costed for. Archaeology as a public good has undergone various paradigm shifts from a focus of engaging the public in archaeological discoveries through outreach to the public undertaking its own community archaeologies. And now there is a trend for the co-production of knowledge which further blurs the boundary between archaeologists and various publics they serve. Another policy concept that is synonymous with archaeology in the UK is the historic environment. This term emerged in the 1990s with the shift away from considering archaeological sites and monuments in isolation towards landscape-wide studies. Through this concept, archaeology was amalgamated into a classification of materials that included above and below ground remains, finds, ecofacts, historic buildings and designated landscapes. Previously, archaeology and buildings have been treated separately as seen in British national legislation and policy, but in 1994, Planning Policy Guidance Note 15, Planning and the Historic Environment, was published to pull together archaeology and the historic built environment, although archaeology was still dealt with under distinct legislation and retained a dedicated planning policy guidance. It was also around this time that work started on the European Landscape Convention, which sought to protect all landscapes and particularly living landscapes to improve quality of life for European citizens. UK national planning policy and international conventions during the 1990s strengthened the standing of archaeology and specified that the conservation and enhancement of archaeological heritage should be a goal of both urban and regional planning, with a focus on the protection of sites for future study. By including archaeology within historic environment, it also brought the discipline in line with other environmental variables managed through spatial planning, such as ecology. Through this linking term, archaeology was included within environmental services managed through spatial planning to protect environmental resources for the benefit of citizens. These ecosystem services and their relationship with archaeology has been investigated by Ben Geary at University College Cork within the context of peatland restoration in Ireland. Since 2012, archaeological and historic environment policy was superseded by the National Planning Policy Framework. There have been lengthy discussions as to whether this new policy framework can unite the various approaches within previous planning policy and whether it adequately covers provisions for public engagement and archaeological archives. And actually, for more information, please refer to the volume 22 of Papers from the Institute of Archaeology, which is published by University College London. My own research focuses on the concept of sustainable development and how this has been incorporated into archaeological heritage management. In 1997, English Heritage produced a discussion paper that sought to recontextualise the concept for use within historic environment policy. This was part of a second wave of international sustainability discourses in the 1990s and the drive to find a way to operationalise what was still quite theoretical with the publication of Agenda 21 Action Plan in 1992. Sustainable development is another concept that has been brought into archaeology but has so far served to only strengthen biases. So, for example, historic buildings are often considered inherently sustainable due to their possibility for reuse. Buildings are often used to demonstrate that the historic environment can contribute to socio-economic sustainability agendas. But where does this leave the archaeological resource? Where does it fit into this? And this is especially with much archaeology having little or no economic value. Archaeology as such is more often than not cited as an obstruction to planning, and this further suggests that archaeology has a parasitic relationship with spatial planning, and that this relationship is itself potentially unsustainable. So to conclude, there are clearly positives to encompassing archaeology within wider concepts of environment because it makes archaeology applicable to contemporary issues and agendas that help to remain socially and politically relevant, but it can also be problematic. The prejudice towards the economic instrumentalisation of culture, heritage and the historic environment has elevated the standing of the built environment but highlighted the ways in which the archaeological materials and practices cannot be instrumentalised and that many are in fact unsustainable themselves. I would like to encourage participants to be very clear about what classes of material and practices within heritage, culture and the historic environment that they are referring to when making assumptions about how archaeology contributes to spatial planning agendas. And this is really to try and untangle archaeology from these umbrella terms. The focus on connecting up archaeology with other agendas has taken focus away from formalising archaeology and maturing it into a profession and a discipline that not only respects the need for inclusivity, but also the standing of its practitioners, who have often dedicated years of their lives to the pursuit of knowledge and experience and the communication of this to society. And finally, we haven't yet connected up the discipline of archaeology itself. There is fragmentation between sectors in terms of who takes responsibility for curating the archaeological resource and who is responsible for training archaeologists of the future. And this is something that will be further investigated later in this working group. So I leave with this question: what is or what should be our archaeological agenda for preventative archaeology undertaken as part of spatial planning and economic development? Thank you.